Hi, all. Welcome to this series of lectures in psychology. In this session, we shall be discussing chapter 3 of the course, that is learning and conditioning. So, this chapter would look into various theories, concepts around the topic learning from a psychological point of view. Um, and this would revolve around various other aspects like conditioning and the various nitty-gritty around conditioning, like acquisition of the conditioning, extinction, recovery, etc. The types of conditioning, classical and operant, uh, comparison of classical and operant conditioning, and a few other theories like observational learning, Bandura's experiments, etc. Okay, let's take a deep dive. Right, to start with, let's define learning. As you can see on the screen, learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. So why is the prefix relatively? Why is it not just called as learning is a permanent change in behavior, as an absolute permanent change in behavior? Why is there a prefix relatively permanent change? Because as you may agree that no learning is permanent. No new learning is permanent. Every new skill or every new knowledge, body of knowledge, has its own relevance and expiry date, and it gets obsolete at some point of time when it is replaced with, when it is substituted by a new school of thought, a new skill, or a new practice, by a new experience. So, which is why learning is defined as relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. So, for instance, earlier most of the projects were driven by in the software companies and other companies too. The projects were driven predominantly by a model called waterfall model, and now you see most of the projects again are influenced by a um, new method of driving projects called agile. So when agile came in, waterfall method had to be driven away. So that's a reason, excuse me, that's a reason why learning is defined as relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Okay, so behavior changes that are due to maturation or due to the temporary conditions are not included. So, what do we mean by that? We will understand from these two channels in which learning takes place. So, learning can happen through broadly through these two ways, namely non-associative learning and associative learning. So non-associative learning, as we just called out, that the temporary conditions due to maturation or temporary conditions, when there is no associated stimulus in place, when it is just between the stimulus and response, and there is no associative, there is no third stimulus, there is no second stimulus in place, it's just one stimulus and one response. It's referred to as non-associative learning, which is caused by two ways, namely habituation and sensitization. What is habituation? Excuse me. If you look at the image above, you see there is a creature, supposedly a mouse, which is kind of scared in the first image because of the blaring of the machine. Machine scares me, and then the next image, it is getting used to the sound produced by the machine. It says these things are starting to grow on me, and the third one says I'm no longer bothered by machine. So what is happening to this creature because of getting acquainted to, or getting used to the machine's sound, is what is precisely referred to as habituation. Habituation is a decrease in an innate response to frequently repeated stimulus. and this results in a decrease in responsiveness. Okay, sensitization, as you can see the image below, sensitization is an increased reaction to the stimulus after repeated exposure. So when there is a loud and more intense stimulus that is striking you, even if it is a repeated one, it is likely to startle you, it is likely to scare you, sensitize you. So these two cannot be considered as a long lasting learning habituation or sensitization. It's temporary because of the intensity of the stimulus. So it's called non associative because there is only one stimulus and one response, right? Okay, that's an exercise for you based on the discussion so far. Answer the two questions before you proceed to the next portion of the video. Okay, so that takes us to the next portion of the video about learning, associative learning. We've just seen non-associative learning. Associative learning is when the actual, the original stimulus is paired, is coupled, is linked to another stimulus which is otherwise neutral and not related to the context. So when you pair it, when you couple it, when you link it with the actual stimulus, the learning starts registering by way of conditioning. What is conditioning? So this conditioning can happen in two ways. Excuse me. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We will understand each of these in depth with the help of a couple of experiments that have been conducted by people around. Okay. So some of the perspectives that have paved a way to the subsequent theories of learning will just take some time in understanding, in knowing people and trying to understand their dispositions, their stands, their ideologies. Like as you see, John Watson was a behaviorist. So largely, if you see, most of the arguments in psychology are split between behaviorists and cognitivists. So it's either it's behaviorism versus cognitivism. So whereas William James' focus was more on consciousness and emotion, Titchener was focused more on the mental structures, the mental models, the mental physiology parts, the functionalities of the structuralism aspect of the brain of human. And finally, Ivan Pavlov, who is actually a physicist and a behaviorist, who will be largely discussed in an elaborate fashion while discussing classical conditioning. We can refer to Ivan Pavlov as the father of classical conditioning, and that will take us into greater understanding of classical conditioning theorized by Ivan Pavlov. Okay, so before we go to the next one, a quick thing to understand between classical and operant conditioning. Why are the two called by these two names? So both are conditioning, both cause conditioning, or both cause alteration in behavior, both cause change in behavior, both cause manipulation in behavior. But classical conditioning is more because of the natural tendencies of the creature, like salivation of the dog. And operant conditioning, which is also referred to as instrumental conditioning. Operant conditioning is because of certain deliberate behaviors of the organism which result in the consequences, in certain consequences. Like I switch I press a switch and the light is on, or I press a switch and I receive a shock, right? So my behavior, my deliberate behavior of operating certain thing is instrumental to is important, is determining to the consequence, leading to certain consequence, which is operant or instrumental conditioning. While classical conditioning is based on the natural tendencies of the human being or an organism for that matter. Operant conditioning is more of the behavioral consequences of the organism. We shall understand these in greater depth when we are discussing the related experiments and theories. We've discussed this. Okay, so before we go to, we just discussed, you can elaborate on the question, the exercise, second one, and please proceed to the next portion only after answering this question. Okay, so that takes us to a greater discussion into a deeper discussion into classical conditioning, wherein Ivan Pavlov had conducted, a Russian physicist had conducted a very interesting, very exciting experiment with a dog, and he actually observed. So it started with a very serendipitous, with a chance observation that when food is presented to a dog, the dog salivates. For that matter, we also salivate, but we, given our civic senses, given our manners, we control the salivation, whereas a dog does not. So visibly, a dog visibly salivates when it is exposed to a delicious food, and and what he observed, the dog salivates mere at the visual of the food, even before tasting it or even smelling it. The very visual of the food is prompting the dog to salivate. And this occurred to Pavlov, whether the salivation, the point of salivation can be altered or not. Can the dog be conditioned to salivate at a different point than than at the point of presenting the visual? So that was the thought that crossed his mind, and he started the experiment with the dog. So what it did, so it started as we said, dog getting salivating at the very visual of the food, and it is not conditioned yet because it's a very natural biological tendency of the dog to salivate at the visual of the food. So there is no conditioning that has taken place yet. So we can call food at this stage as unconditioned stimulus to which the dog is salivating by dog is responding by salivating. So at this point the food is unconditioned stimulus because it's not conditioned yet, and salivating is unconditioned response because the response is not conditioned, it's natural, it is biologically natural, and it is not conditioned. And at this point you can refer to another stimulus which is not at all related to either food or salivating. Say for instance a light, which is also switched on incidentally, which has nothing to do with the presenting of the food. But then Ivan Pavlov decided to make this light, you can call it a horn too. In this illustration, we'll take light. Ivan Pavlov decided to make this light a part of the experiment. So what he did, he paired the light, switching on of the light and offering the food to the dog several times, repeated trials of switching on the light, presenting the food, switching on the light, presenting the food, switching on the light, presenting the food. So what happened? After several trials like this, dog had registered a new learning that switching on of the light has something to do with offering of the food. So until now, dog which was salivating at the offering of the food now has registered switching on of the light synonymous to offering of the food, and it was observed that dog started salivating at the switching on of the light itself. And this is what is we refer to as conditioning. Dog has been successfully conditioned from an unconditioned state, that is salivating at food, to a new state, a conditioned state of salivating at switching on of the bulb. So we can say dog has learned. Learning has registered in the dog through the process of conditioning, right? So if you look at the similar thing in real life, how can you associate? So for instance, there's a latecomer, the person who is habituated to arrive, employee who's habituated to arrive late to the office, and if there are repeat trials of deduction in his salary, whenever he comes late, there is deduction in salary. So why do you think what it might result? So once he or she realizes that arriving late to the office is resulting in deduction in salary. So there is a possibility that the person gets conditioned to the response of the employer and might bring in a behavioral correction in himself and come to the office late. This can be seen as an example of conditioning the behavior towards correction. Okay, excuse me. So there were several other things that were observed uh, as a part of this experiment. So this process of acquiring the new learning and salivating, which is in this case, dog's case, salivating on the blaring of the horn or lighting of the bulb, is referred to as acquisition. Acquisition, that is, a new learning has been acquired by the dog. However, it was also seen that if this is followed by repeated trials of switching the light on and not presenting the food, you know, so what happens in the beginning? The dog would expect the food to come and it salivates, and not finding the food, it the salivation reduces. So, and when you repeat that for several trials, switching the light on and not presenting the food, not offering the food, gradually the rate of salivating reduces and it reaches a stage which is called as extinction. The conditioned response extincts because the conditioned stimulus has become irrelevant now. The conditioned stimulus has stopped working. So conditioned response also will reduce and will go extinct, and God will the dog will get back to its natural biological tendency of salivating at the presenting of the food. And it was also observed that though it extincts, it does not vanish. It does not completely disappear from the mental spaces. It is there somewhere at the subconscious level. So when you do it once again, after some gap, after some point of time, after some days, when you switch the light on and present the food, dog has been seen to be able to recall the pairing of light and the food, and the salivation had begun again. However, the rate of salivation has been seen to be lesser than, as you can see from the graph, the recovery rate is the graph is lesser than as compared to the acquisition graph, right? So acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery were some of the features that were observed in the experiment in the behavior of the dog, and that is what we refer to as classical conditioning. And another feature that was observed in dogs' behavior, that is stimulus generalization. When you are switching on a bulb, not exactly same bulb but similar bulb to the one which you have been switching on, dog still responds in same way because it is able to generalize the stimulus, right? If it is something totally different, like stimulus discrimination, if you present a totally, say, blinking bulb as against a blinking red bulb as against a stable yellow bulb, it is totally different, and the dog was seen to be discriminating successfully also. So while it was able to generalize the stimulus which were similar and comparable, it was also able to discriminate the stimulus which was totally different from the actual conditioned stimulus. So those are also two observations that Ivan Pavlov's experiment had brought out, right? So, for instance, we also, how many of you? I don't know how many of you can discriminate between Coke and Pepsi. I myself personally have have failed several times in discriminating, but there are people who just at sip of a gulp, they can say this is Pepsi, this is Coke. So the discrimination capabilities vary from individual to individual. Generalization is likewise also a feature. So those are the aspects of classical conditioning: acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization, and stimulus discrimination. You can call those as the observations that come out of the experiment of classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov. Okay, that's the third exercise in this chapter. Please proceed to the next portion of video only after answering these two questions based on the discussion in the previous portion. Okay, so that was another experiment in accordance with Pavlov's experiment, where Edward Thorndike, had brought out these two aspects of insight and the law of effect. How do we understand these? So he tried caging a cat and placing a piece of fish. Cat loves fish. It likes feasting on a fish. So it was placed in a bowl which was a bit beyond the reach of the cat, as you can see in the image, and the cage was loosely locked. It was locked in a way that after a several hit and trial and error efforts by the organism, the cat here, it can be opened. It's not tightly locked, it was loosely locked. So what was observed is cat was engaged in a hit and trial, that is trial and error of various tactics, various ways, various methods of playing around with the lock, with the latch, with the door, and finally, when it successfully opened the latch, it reached out and it could access the fish. But that's not the catch of the experiment. The catch of the experiment was, as you see the two images below, when the cat was put again in the cage with the latch locked in a similar way, it did not take the same amount of time in unlocking the latch and reaching out to the fish, which means it had very clearly rejected, it had very clearly bypassed all those methods which had not worked in its previous attempts, which means the learning as insight. It had learning registered on its mind, it had insights that it has developed, and it repeated only those tactics which helped it to unlock the latch and reach out to the fish. So, which is what is referred to here as insight and the law of effect. Law of effect, what does it suggest? Law of effect suggests that we are motivated to repeat only those actions or those gestures which are rewarding. Why resort to those things which are not rewarding, right? Law of effect. So that was a outcome of Edward Thorndike's experiment with the cat, latch, and the fish. Okay, so that's another experiment, another very exciting, very interesting experiment by B.F. Skinner, who had. So we have seen dog by Pavlov, we have seen cat by Thorndike, and here it is a mouse which was used by B.F. Skinner in his experiments around instrumental conditioning. Why is it called instrumental conditioning? Because here, unlike the dog's natural or the behavioral tendencies, it is what is instrumental is the mouse's behavior. Its behavior and the consequences of its behavior are important in determining the subsequent behavior of the mouse. Instrumental means something that is important, something that is significant. So what is significant here? Significant is the mouse's behavior, resulting consequences, and the resulting effect on the subsequent behavior of the mouse is what is seen affecting the mouse here. So what was done? The mouse was, as you can see, was placed in a cage, and the cage had two levers that the rat could pull within its reach. So, and what was the scheme? What was the design? Pulling one lever, which was colored red, would offer mild shocks, electric shocks to the mouse, which will not kill the mouse, but which will definitely irritate it, discomfort it. And another green colored lever, which when pulled, it offers the pellets of food, the food balls to the mouse. So it goes without saying that the mouse would like to pull more of the green lever as against the red, because no one would like to have shocks when given a choice between food and shock, isn't it? So it was seen that after several trials of pulling of pressing the two levers, the mouse here had received a learning by insight that the red lever is not supposed to be pressed because it is offering you shocks, and the green is rewarding, so press only green. So that is, so behavior, it was behavior of the mouse that resulted in a consequence, that is offering the food or the shock, and that resulted in the shaping of the behavior of the rat or of the mouse, whatever. That is a very clear choice of pulling, of pressing only the green lever and not the red lever. And this was seen to be very exciting insights that came out of instrumental conditioning. More about the outcomes, learning outcomes of instrumental conditioning, we shall take up in the next few slides. Okay, that's the next exercise. I guess the fourth, as it shows 3.2, it's 3.4. Please answer the question based on the discussion in the previous portion of the video, and then move into the next portion. Okay, so those are a few outcomes that you can realize, you can understand from the instrumental conditioning experiment by B.F. Skinner. So here are the four broad classification of the behavioral tendencies that Skinner could classify. Firstly, he broadly identified that the behavioral consequences were broadly classified into two effects. One, either the mouse was reinforced. Reinforcement means something like a reward, right? So you reinforce with the food pellets here, or the mouse was punished, right? So either it is reinforcement or punishment. So likewise, if you look at from a workplace point of view, the employees, various employees, for their behaviors are either reinforced with rewards or punished with various counter actions to reduce. So again, each of these, reinforcement and punishment, have been classified into either positive or negative. So when you say positive here, essentially you need to understand positive. When you say positive, which means you are offering something, you are giving something. Whereas when you say negative, you are pulling something off, you are taking something away. You are pulling out something, or you are taking something away, right? So positive reinforcement. What do you mean by positive reinforcement? You are offering a reward. You are offering a reward that is so positive reinforcement is rewarding by way of offering a stimulus, offering a comfortable stimulus, offering a desirable stimulus, right? Delivery of a pleasant or appetitive stimulus. That is, you work hard and you're promoted. As simple as that, right? So your hard work is recognized by offering you a offering you a promotion. Likewise, negative reinforcement. So it is reinforcement. The intention is to reward you. Intention is to recognize you by way of taking away something that is discomforting you. Removal of an unpleasant or aversive stimulus. Say, for instance, you've been working hard, and your boss wants to recognize you, reward you by taking an unpleasant or uncomfortable stimulus. What could it be? Say your boss tells you, you don't need to register your attendance. I'm convinced in your sincerity. So attendance mandatory compulsion is taken away from you. Be happy, enjoy. So that could be an example of negative reinforcement, right? It is negative. Because you're taking something away. But what are you taking as against in case of positive? You're taking something away which has been causing discomfort to the organism. So that's how we understand negative reinforcement. Positive punishment. As you see, positive punishment, the intention is to punish, penalize, is to cause pain deliberately. By doing what? By offering or delivering an unpleasant stimulus. You give him a demotion because of their unpleasant gestures, non-productivity, or unfriendly attitude. You demote a person, you deliver them a demotion. That is positive punishment. Whereas negative punishment, intent again is to punish, but by removal of a pleasant or appetitive stimulus. You have maybe an employee has been enjoying a chauffeur facility, driver-driven car facility, chauffeur-driven car facility, but you're not happy with the way the resources are being utilized. It's being misutilized. So you remove the privilege which the employee has been enjoying and cause punishment and affect punishment to the employee. So those can be the examples and the descriptions of each of those: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. And if you take reinforcement aspect of the two, reinforcement and punishment, so you have to appreciate the fact that what we get out of the mouse's experiment are these two aspects: reinforcement and punishment. Receiving the food pellets by the mouse is seen as reinforcement, and receiving the shocks on pressing another lever is seen as a punishment. So that's the root source from where reinforcement, the effect of reinforcement and effect of punishment on the organism has been gathered from the experiment. And furthermore, with regard to reinforcement has been here seen based on two aspects. One, in interval schedules. Interval, what do you mean by interval? Interval has something, the word interval has something to do with, say for instance, you have employees working on various jobs, various tasks, and some of the tasks are time bounded, and some of the tasks, respective to the time, they are productivity oriented. How much or how many have you produced, and how long did you take to produce whatever, or to deliver the results that were given to you. So broadly, if you see, how long do you take to deliver what is entrusted to you is referred to here as interval schedules. And what is your productivity, what is the quantity of your productivity is what is ratio. So those are the two fundamental bases that can be understood with the help of Skinner's experiment here. Reinforcement can be based, reinforcement to employees or people around or other workplaces can be understood from two types of reinforcement. Reinforcement based on the time one takes, and the reinforcement based on the productivity one delivers, right? And again, each of these schedules, interval and ratio, can be further divided into fixed interval, Fixed interval, for example, if you look at the employees in government, right? Government, so they have a time bound promotion irrespective of productivity if their conduct, discipline, their behavior, their performance is seen to be satisfactory on the ground on certain periodicity, say once in 5 years or 10 years, as the case may be. Every say for instance, if you look at the pay revision of government employees, I'm sure you must have heard there's something called a pay revision for every 10 years for the central government employees in India. And this pay revision is done by a commission which is created, which is constituted to understand the salaries, to understand inflation, and to uh, determine the new revised pay. So what is this based on? Based on interval, not ratio, right? Irrespective of the performance, everybody will be given a hike because of the inflationary and the external pressures. So that is interview fixed interval schedule. Whereas there could be some jobs where it is based on interval, but then at what interval? It need not be every 5 years, it need not be every 10 years, but it has to be interval based, which is variable. Varying amount of time passes between each reinforcement. It could be once in 2 years, it could be once in 4 years, maybe it depends on the performance of your organization. If your organization is delivering super profits, it has been selling well, it has been expanding, then the organization is happy, making more money. So give based on, so next in the next 3 years, in the, make the promotions after, and it might not happen in the next 5 years. So there is no fixed certainty, and hence it's referred to as variable interval schedule. Likewise, ratio schedules is based on the quantity, based on the productivity, not necessarily on the time period, and hence, again, similarly, each of these ratio schedules can be classified into either fixed, that is, for every 10 cars you sell, you will get this much of what do you call the commission, or the performance bonus, right? Likewise, so that's an example of fixed ratio. Whereas there could be variable ratio schedule also, which occurs after a varying number of responses, whatever, irrespective of your performance. It may also take some other external factors, organizational factors, economic factors into consideration, and the base is of course ratio based, but then it is variable. It may not be fixed, like we discussed in the above one. So those are the two broad bases of reinforcement schedules, that is interval schedules and ratio schedules, and each of these is again based on their specificity, certainty, periodicity. They can be classified into fixed interval schedule, variable interval schedule, likewise fixed ratio schedule, and variable ratio schedule. Okay, another important experiment by Mayer and Seligman, the gentlemen you see in the images, they had come up with a very important observation, which you can see down below there, which is a very crucial concept in psychology called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness, what it means. So what they did, they took two dogs, while Pavlov had taken one dog, Meyer and Seligman had taken two dogs, and the two dogs were kept in two different closed chambers, right? Two different closed chambers, and both were offered mild shocks, and in such a way that one dog had the privilege, had the opportunity to turn a switch off or press a button which would stop the delivery of the shocks. The other dog was not offered that privilege. It had to take the shocks all through as long as the shocks were delivered. So that was part one of the experiment. One dog which had the option of pressing the button and avoiding the shock, the other dog which did not have the option of pressing the button, and hence it had to take the shocks whichever way. And the part two of the experiment was where the the dogs were kept in a chamber like that you see in the image here, where the dogs were offered the shocks, and the chamber had a, a barricade which could be jumped over, which could be surmounted, which could be overcome by jumping to the other side. And jumping to the other side means no shock. You see shock in this chamber and no shock in the other chamber. And the same two dogs were kept in this shock chamber. And what was observed is the dog which had learned to avoid the shock was seen successfully jumping to the chamber which was not um, which was not offering the shock. And the dog which had got conditioned to the shocks, it did not even make any attempt to jump over to the other chamber, because it learned, and it told to itself by learning that shock is inevitable, shock is unavoidable. So you jump or you don't, it doesn't matter, shock will anyway come. So that was the state of the dog. The other dog, which received continued receiving the shock, is said to be in a state of learned helplessness. You can see a similar behavior in the horses and the elephants in in the temples. If you have seen or wherever for that matter, elephants which are tied with a very meek, very thin rope which is tied against um, any call it a chair or a pole, which could be with minimal effort by an animal like elephant, which could be very easily broken, but it does not. Why? Because initially when it is chained, it is chained with a heavy chain and locked properly, and after a period of time, after the initial efforts to break away from the chain, it realizes, it gets conditioned, and it learns, it tells to itself that this cannot be gotten away with, you have to live with it. So after that, learning happening to the organism. Even if you tie the organism with a jute rope against, as common thing as a chair, as you see in the image, the animal will just not make any effort, because it has gone into the state of, it has gone into a state called learned helplessness. Because of its previous experience, it has learned that it is of no use jumping, and you have to live with it. So they continue living in that. So that was a crucial outcome of Mayer and Seligman's experiment with the dog. Okay, that's an exercise after the portion. Please answer the questions before you move into the next portion of the video. Okay, and that's another crucial experiment which was conducted by Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura had conducted this experiment to demonstrate uh, observational learning by observation, and which says that we learn a lot of things by observing people around, observing the situations around, and it was demonstrated very well with the help of an experiment here. Uh, so one of the Bandura's early studies concerned the observational learning of aggressive behavior in young children. So what it did, as you can see, in this study by Albert Bandura, a group of children were shown adult models, in real adult models, who were behaving aggressively towards a bobo doll, and another group of children was exposed to adult models who were behaving non-aggressively. Bobo doll, I'm sure all of you must have played with a bobo doll, a doll which is filled with air, and you're supposed to hit on its nose. What kind of doll that you see in the image here? So these kids were exposed to a bunch of adults two categories of kids were exposed to two categories of adults, who were one category who were behaving aggressive, and the other category who were behaving non-aggressive. And later, after adequate exposure, after adequate observation of these adults by the kids were led into a room in which they could play with many different toys. And as can be expected, the kids who were exposed to aggressive behavior started behaving aggressively, and the kids who were exposed to non-aggressive behavior started continued behaving in a very stable and non-aggressive manner. So this Bandura had repeated a similar experiment by exposing kids to two categories of kids, one to aggressive movie clips and the other to non-aggressive movie clips, which further reinforced, which further strengthened the conclusions that kids who are exposed to aggressive surroundings, aggressive people, are likely to imbibe, are likely to inculcate, are likely to ingrain the same aggressiveness into themselves, and they are likely to grow up as aggressive adults, and they are likely to continue aggressiveness as their personality trait, right? As against those who are brought up in a relatively non-aggressive, plain, stable, and a desirable behavior. So that was learning and conditioning by observation, as was established by Albert Bandura. Okay, so that's a question to conclude the session with. Please answer this question before you conclude the session. Thank you all. Shall be back with another topic in another session. Till then, see you all.